Hello, everybody. My name is Grant Kastner. I am Extempore's community manager. Thank you so much for joining this webinar tonight on enacting anti-colonial and anti-racist language pedagogies. We are thrilled and honored to present Dr. LJ Randolph Jr. from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Hello, LJ. And we are doing this. We are doing this webinar in part with our friends from Central States. And before we begin, I'll let Daryl say a few words on behalf of Central States.
Great, thank you so much. Would it be possible to turn my video on just so that the folks can put a face with the name?
Yes, one sec.
There we go. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. LJ, nice to meet you. Grant, same thing. My name is Daryl Bialis. I'm the executive director with the Central States Conference. I want to thank Extempore and LJ for putting this webinar on tonight. We're very happy to have such a great partner with Extempore over the past few years, and Extempore is going to be at our conference again, which is coming up in March 9th through the 11th. We're in Columbus, Ohio this year. So just a shameless plug for the organization. If you have not registered yet, there's still time. Registration's open until February 15th. And we hope to see you all there. Without further ado, I will let Grant and LJ take it away. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. I hope you find this rewarding and enjoy your time.
Awesome. I don't have much else to add. So LJ, floor is yours.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks to Extempore and Central States for sponsoring this webinar. It's really cool to look in the chat and to see all the different people and the places that you're from. I see like folks from back in North Carolina and people in Wisconsin whom I haven't met yet, people that I met when I was in Minnesota a few months ago. So I'm excited to be here, and I am excited to be able to be a part of Central States. I'm moving from SCOLT, the Southern Conference on Language Teaching, and it's just been a great experience so far. So excited for the move and excited to be in Wisconsin. You can find my contact information on this first slide here at the very bottom there. My email address, feel free to email me if you have any questions or ideas or feedback. And you feel free to connect with me via social media at the Prof. Randolph handle there. So as I said, I'm super excited to be part of the Central States organization. I'm currently at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I moved here from University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And fun fact about me, I've literally only lived in 2 communities my whole life. I was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I grew up in Wilmington and the small towns that are around there. Then I went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina for college, and I did all of my degrees at the university there in Chapel Hill. And I taught high school for about 10 years there, and then I moved back to Wilmington to work at the university there. And so then my family and I made this huge move from North Carolina to Wisconsin, but very happy to be here. Some of the goals of this webinar, I have 5 things that I hope that I'll be able to accomplish during our time together here. First of all, I want to identify how races and colonial ideologies have influenced the teaching and learning of languages. We want to define then what anti-racism and anti-colonialism looks like in the context of language pedagogies. Then we're going to look at some curricular interventions that reflect anti-racist and anti-colonial frameworks, explore how such frameworks can be enacted in language classrooms, have some examples from my own classroom, and then a couple of hypothetical examples in languages other than Spanish. And then hopefully we'll have a good amount of time for some discussion questions to talk about any questions or next steps or recommendations that you all have, as well as any of the challenges that we might come across. And if you see me talk about this topic before, hopefully there's at least something new in this presentation that will connect with you. So I always like to begin by talking about my positionality, because I feel like any topic really, but especially a topic such as anti-racism, anti-colonialism, I don't consider myself to be an objective voice. So it's important to know just a little bit about my journey. I already shared a little bit about where I grew up and where I'm from, but I want to talk about my experience learning Spanish in high school. That's when I started. I was in 10th grade. And what's interesting is during that time, the late 90s in North Carolina was a new gateway state for immigration for folks from Mexico and Central America. So there were lots of people who spoke Spanish, who were from Mexico and Guatemala, Honduras, who lived in my neighborhood, really. But I never had any connection with them. I didn't hang out or play with people who spoke Spanish. I didn't even see them in my school, so I don't know what classes they were taking or what was going on. And certainly when I was studying Spanish, I thought of it as a foreign language in every sense of the word. It was very foreign. It was exciting and novel and interesting, but it was foreign, which looking back, I always found that odd, how there are so many Latinx and Spanish-speaking people right there in my community, but I never saw them represented in the curriculum, and we never connected sort of what was happening in our own communities to what we were learning about in the class. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Spanish. I became a Spanish professor, for crying out loud, but it definitely was a foreign experience for me. And I certainly, if I didn't see that, I definitely didn't see any representation of Black folks in the classroom. I guess subconsciously, I knew that there had to be Black people who spoke Spanish, but I had never seen them, and they weren't in any of the videos that we watched or any of the pictures in the textbook or anything like that. So I really didn't make that connection until I was in college, and I started developing friendships with people who were native and heritage speakers of Spanish of various races. So I didn't make that connection either personally or professionally until well into my study of the language. And when I became a teacher, then my interest in social justice came from my desire to connect with my students and wanting my students to discover and know that language learning is relevant to them, no matter who they are, and that it ultimately can be a unifying and empowering experience at all levels, right? I didn't want my students to feel like they had to wait until the AP Spanish or until they got into college in order to experience that diversity and that connection and that transformation that is possible through the study of languages. So let's talk a little bit about definitions here. What is coloniality? The main part of this isn't really defining what coloniality is. I think we can all guess what that is, but I have this definition here to remind us that it's something that is just pervasive. It's in the books that we read. It's in our criteria for academic performance at K through 12 and higher education. It's in our cultural patterns. It defines what we think of as common sense. It impacts our self-image. And it also impacts the aspirations that we have of ourselves and others. And so I think it's important to realize that it's not just applicable within the classroom, but really in all elements of our lives. We're sort of inundated with this mist of coloniality and racism, really. And I have a couple of examples of that from the language that I teach. For example, here, when I type in Spanish book in Amazon, this is what comes up, right? I have representation of Spain. It goes back to Spain, that idea that, yeah, Spanish is about Spain. And you see here, there's outlines of Spain, the country, their colors associated with the Spanish flag. And then that workbook there on the right, even if there's some type of effort to show diversity, is done in these very stereotyped and problematic ways, as you can see there. These ideologies are also present in the way that we think about and design our curricula, right? And so at my previous institution, once you go through the language courses, the level 1 through 4, and then you take maybe a composition class, a conversation class, if you want to study advanced cultural or civilization or literary topics, you had two options, basically. You could take topics in Spanish civilization and topics in Spanish literature, or you could take topics in Spanish American civilization and topics in Spanish American literature. And we know that the cultural production of one country is not equivalent to the cultural production of the entirety of Spanish America, but we group it that way, and that's a reflection of the colonial ideologies that we bring to the study of languages. This is also prevalent in the way that we think about historical events. On the left-hand side there, you can see a photo representation of what is known as La Noche Triste, which is one of the nights when, one of the battles where the Aztecs essentially had a victory over the Spaniards. But throughout history, it's called La Noche Triste, the sad night, because we know that history is written from the perspective of the victors. It certainly wasn't sad for the Aztecs, and that they experienced essentially a victory that night. And so there's a movement to rename that in our history books and call it the Night of Victory. That's part of the discourse that's surrounded that topic right now. When I had the pleasure of going to Mexico in 2021, we know that's the 500th anniversary of what we typically call the conquest, the Spanish conquest. And so that also reflects a colonial ideology. And I don't know if you can read the banner there, but it says 500 years of indigenous resistance. And so there's this movement to reframe that as not a conquest, but a war and a resistance of the indigenous people of Mexico. It's prevalent even in ways that I had never thought of, even though I taught Spanish for such a long time. And an example of that, when I was in Mexico and interacting with some of the scholars there and their studies of the archives, one of the scholars shared this with me from a study that he was doing. This is Simón Bolívar, who, you know, we kind of think of as sort of the liberator, the George Washington of South America. I'm not going to lie, when I taught high school Spanish, I had posters of him in my classroom, right? But you can see here what he wrote about Vicente Guerrero, who was the first president of at least partial African descent of Mexico. And he called him a barbarian of the southern coast, a vile freak of nature from a wild Indian woman and a savage African man. And, you know, these are people that I had in my classroom as sort of heroes of the Spanish-speaking world. Another example of that, I love the microcuento, the microstory genre of Argentina. I love many of the authors who are involved in that. Jorge Luis Borges, Julio Cortázar, many others, Enrique Emerson, Imbert. Like I love that genre. And when you dig into some of Jorge Luis Borges's philosophies, you'll see some of the problematic statements that he has said multiple times throughout his life. And there's a link there for you to read more about this. But he says that Blacks are unbearable. And I don't retract what I've said many times. And he has, and it's documented. But he says Americans made a grave mistake in educating them as slaves. They were like children. They were happier and less annoying. And it's interesting because these ideologies are present in the minds of the people whose work we value in our classes. And in my case anyway, I was ignorant of a lot of this before, before I was made aware of it. And we didn't talk about this in the context of studying Borges, right? It was sort of his work was sort of presented as something that came from a neutral political stance. And I think that's very problematic. I think we really have to look at the source of the people who are producing the works that we're using in our classrooms, because that's also part of the story. And so we won't actually have a discussion here, but this is just something for you to think about. I gave some examples about colonial and racist ideologies in Spanish. So I want you to think about, in your instructional context, what are some ways that you see colonial and racist ideologies? Think intentionally about that, because this is really step one of the process, identifying where these ideologies exist and what we already do and the resources that we use. And also think about how might these ideologies affect the way students view language learning, and what is within my realm of influence? What can I control? Many of these issues are institutional and maybe outside of our immediate control. We can certainly work toward justice, but what are some things that I actually do have control over in my classroom, where I can really make intentional steps in order to enact anti-racist and anti-colonial pedagogies? When I did that Fulbright in Mexico in 2021, one of the participants who gave me permission to share this is a community college administrator. And she, like many of our students, I think, took a few semesters of Spanish in college, didn't become fluent in it, just took what was necessary and to the extent, what she was interested in, but, her major didn't allow for her to minor in it or double major in it. And at the end of the experience, when all of the scholars, when we were reflecting on what we learned from that experience, something that she said really stood out to me. She said, "I'm pretty pissed off that I didn't learn about Afro-Mexican or Afro-Latin identities and cultures in my Spanish classes. Now, whose fault is that, right?" And the parts that stand out to me are being pissed off, because that I can relate to that, right? I also felt kind of cheated in my own experience of learning language. And then also the whose fault is that? So it goes back to what I was saying earlier. What's within my realm of influence when we think about enacting anti-racist and anti-colonial pedagogies? Here's a quote from a study that Uju Anya did, talking to teachers of Black students. And this teacher said it's total invisibility. And I want to note here the impact of that. And that last sentence really gets to that. This invisibility is contributing to a Black student's attitude or feeling like they're not connected to the class. And potentially, we may be turning away a diverse pool of future language majors and future language teachers in our society. And that's just one consequence, one part of the impact of all of this. So I think this is very important. I'm going to be talking about anti-racism and anti-colonialism, and so you should probably know what I mean when I say these terms. When I say anti-racist, I am talking about actively combating the erasure, the violence, the marginalization, the discrimination of minoritized racial groups, and not only combating that, but uplifting and celebrating the liberation efforts of those communities, focusing on those narratives of joy and resistance. And when I say anti-colonial, I mean combating, in the case of Spanish, the Eurocentric and colonial ideologies that have set the status quo for our institutions. Kishimoto, speaking more generally about anti-racist education, reminds us that it's not just about how we teach, right? It is about that, but it's about so much more. It's also about our awareness, our self-reflection in a variety of contexts, right? When we think about our discipline, our research, at the department level, the institution level, the community level, et cetera. So it's much broader than teaching in the classroom. It's about community, really, and I think that's important to keep in mind. I also want to remind us that decolonization is not a metaphor. True decolonization as you can see here, building on Tuck and Yang, true decolonization would be restorative justice, right? It would be repatriation of indigenous people's lands. It would be reparations for African descendants of enslaved people. So it's not a metaphor for other things like instructional practice. For that reason, I usually prefer anti-colonial or anti-colonialism because I think it recognizes the impact of colonization and what we're resisting, but it doesn't imply that we're necessarily undoing colonization at the systemic level. That's the much broader movement that, yeah, we want to be a part of, but we have to remind ourselves that, you know, that's not what we're doing in the classroom. So let's not be so quick to pat ourselves on the back and say, yeah, I have a decolonial classroom. Well, unless you're doing the things that are on this slide, unless you're giving land back or giving reparations to folks, you're not really engaged in what decolonial practices would really look like at the systemic level. Also, a lot of my work centers Blackness. I don't think we necessarily have to center Blackness, but that's one way that I go about thinking how we can enact anti-racist and anti-colonial pedagogies. I love this quote from my friend and scholar, Tasha Austin. She reminds us that centering Blackness is not about responding to who is in the classroom. So you can center Blackness even if you don't have any Black students in your classroom, right? It's not about who necessarily is in the classroom, but rather who is currently in the world and who will be in the world we want to create. And I think a focus on racial justice is important because historically, racial justice movements have been the impetus for other justice movements to follow. And race is something that intersects with other identities and often informs justice when we think about it more broadly. For example, there are intersections of race with gender equity, wealth equity, immigrant rights, indigenous rights, environmental justice, just to name a few. And if you're in this presentation and you're thinking, well, this isn't really relevant to the language that I teach, I guarantee you, if you Google racism in whatever community you can think of, even if you think it's the most progressive community in the world, I guarantee you, if you Google racism in, racism in whatever place, there'll be communities there who are engaged in activism for racial justice, I guarantee it. I also want to remind us that Blackness and Indigenous are the fight for racial justice and equity for Black populations, Indigenous populations is interrelated. I love this quote by Django Paris. He says, "We must continue to explicitly connect Black and Native experiences of settler violence, knowing that the Academy will continually to imagine our struggles as separate and competing unless we refuse that narrative." And so you'll see in the examples that I use, Blackness and Indigenousness are sort of intertwined. And I don't think of them necessarily as separate entities in all contexts. And before we go to the next part, it's important to remember that this work requires intentionality, some self-reflection, collaboration. That's why I'm glad that we're here in a community, and hopefully in the discussion at the end, we'll get some good ideas there. And then it also requires humility and understanding that we don't know everything, that we may get certain things wrong, being able to embrace the messiness of it at times and realizing that that's okay. So I want to talk first about curriculum development. I realize that we all work in different instructional contexts. We teach different languages in different communities, in different levels across the educational spectrum. We also have different levels of curricular freedom. For example, some of us may have prescribed lessons that we have to teach, where every teacher has to be teaching the same thing within that particular institution on a particular day. Some of us may have prescribed curriculum materials, like we all use the same syllabus or the same textbook or whatever. And, some of us may be at the other end of the spectrum where you have curricular freedom, where you can teach whatever you want. And I put freedom in quotes because, we still are bound by the policies of the institution in terms of things like grading and all of that, how you engage with your students, et cetera. I recommend that you keep that in mind and think about, okay, in my context, what is reasonable for me to do as I think about this work? I love this quote from Yvette de Chavez. She is credited with starting the whole decolonize your syllabus movement. And I want us to think about, in our unique instructional context, what does this mean to you? And if you don't use a syllabus, I know that's something that's really used in institutions of higher education, thinking about decolonizing your curriculum guide or whatever, what does that mean to you? What does that phrase mean to you? And this is just something to think about. Why? Why do we need to think about this? Well, this is a 2022 study, people. And Padilla and Bana found that when they looked at curriculum materials, textbooks, in terms of the actual text and in terms of the visuals that they examined, Afro-Latinx folks were collectivized and personalized and represented with superficial elements. And they uncovered the erasure, the tourist gaze, stereotypes, and blatant issues of racism and colorism, even in contemporary books. So this is not a problem of the past. This is an issue with the current curricular materials that are common throughout our institutions. One way to push back against this is through counter-narratives, which Solórzano and Yosso call a method of telling the stories of the people whose experiences are not often told. Counter-narratives are important because they shatter complacency, they challenge the dominant discourse on race, and they further the struggle for racial reform. I found when I center counter-narratives, we move away from narratives of conquering, oppression, and victimhood to narratives of resistance, liberation, and joy. So what can we do? Well, start with what you have. Start small. Think of a topic that's taught in your course where you want to begin your point of entry, and think, is there a history behind this cultural academic topic that might reveal past or present inequities? Are there accepted truths about this topic that I might be able to challenge by bringing in perspectives that aren't normally included in the curriculum materials that I use? Or is this a topic that people from different groups might view differently? And I'll show you an example of how that works in my class. So this is the textbook that was required when I taught Spanish. And the language functions that students were supposed to master were narrating in the past and discussing travel. And the context that they did that in the textbook were through household chores, shopping, international air, and lodging. So the activities in the book were kind of like, did you mop the floor this morning? Did you vacuum this morning? Did you make your bed, kind of? And students will talk in the past about whether or not they did those things, et cetera. And so as you can imagine, it's not particularly engaging or relevant for a lot of students. And also it's not critical in many ways. And so what I did, and I see someone in the chat talking about it being grammar-based, definitely. So what I did with this is I thought about, how can I still make sure students are thinking about these same language functions, but how can I create an essential question that will motivate us to move beyond the confines of those contexts, of that grammar and vocabulary that students are supposed to be mastering, in order to get students to think about things more broadly, while at the same time building their language proficiency. And so I started that by coming up with a new essential question. What are the motivations and outcomes of our life trajectories across geography and time? And so the modified themes, instead of talking about household chores, shopping, and international travel, we talked about movement in our daily lives, what our experience was like in our daily lives. What are the paths of our ancestors? what is it like when people move from different communities to another community? So we talked about immigrant rights, and we talked about family and community histories and traditions, and it became a much more engaging unit, while at the same time allowing students to achieve the language functions that, that they should master at this particular level. So I want to show you an example of what that looked like. So we began with representation, which, if you heard me speak before, I always say representation is the absolute lowest bar. We can't stop here. This can't be the last activity, right? This has to be the opening activity for this particular learning segment. So with my students, I co-created a collage of Afro-Latin figures that they might know. This included entertainers, athletes, historic figures. And it was just to show and to put us in the mindset of, okay, there are people of Afro-Latin descent all throughout the Spanish-speaking world, the US and Spain and Argentina and any country you can think of, basically, or any community you could think of, Puerto Rico, wherever. And then we did a word cloud on one or more of the following terms. And we thought about how these concepts might reflect the experiences of various cultures in our community and how they might uniquely impact the experiences of people of African descent. So what does it mean when I say resistance, when I say liberation, when I say joy? And then these are novice learners, by the way. So we're just listing terms at this point. I had them define the following terms. If this were a more advanced group, maybe have them actually give definitions, or if it's, like I said, more novice level learners, just have them create a word map with a list related terms. So what is normal? What is erasure? What is invisibility? What is race? What is nationality? And I'll show you a sample of what we came up with when we talked about nationality. So you can see there, they had words like border, immigration, war, country, community, people, and then listing various nationalities like American, Mexican, whatever, Panamanian. And then using notes from that activity, I wanted them to write a follow-up sentence to each of these quotes. And these quotes were taken from either news articles or even in some cases, academic articles about ways that certain Mexican communities thought about race. And you can see here some of the quotes from that. So the first one says, there are no Black people here. Here, they're just normal people. Okay, so what does that mean? How would you follow that up? What would the next sentence to that be? The next one, we're Mexican. There are no Black people here. And then the third quote there, in Mexico, there are no Black people. Here, we're Mexican. Okay, so thinking about identifying ourselves based on nationality rather than race, and how in some cases, for some people, those are seen as sort of mutually exclusive. So that's the narrative. And then I introduced my students to a counter-narrative. So we looked at the activism work of Andre Los Sanchez, who is an Afro-Mexican artist. He has great TikTok videos which are very useful in class. They're very short, accessible language. You can do a lot with your students with that. But he had this video series where he talked to people who identified as Afro-Mexican about their experiences in Mexico. I won't play the video just for time, and also I know this is going to be posted to YouTube. I don't want to get, I don't want to get it flagged for copyright violation or anything like that. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to share the link with you so that you can access this presentation and be able to click on all of the resources that I have included in here. But the first quote in this video, the person says, "We are a non-white country that believes itself to be white." And so that's where I start this conversation with my students, by using that counter narrative. And then we go on and I talk about what I call roots and roots, R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-E-S, looking at Black settlements in Central and South America, showing that this all of these places have a very rich history of African influence. So we look at those settlements and those communities. We look at narratives of enslaved people who escaped from the US and traveled south. We often hear narratives about people who escape to the north, but there are many people who also escaped south to experience freedom in Mexico that they could not experience in the United States. The US, as we know, abolished slavery in 1865, which didn't mean a lot at the time, really. And Mexico abolished slavery pretty much a generation earlier in 1837. And we also, and just to remind you, when I give you the link, you'll be able to click on these images and it will take you to resources to learn more about this so that you can implement it in your own classes. And we also center the experiences of liberators in Mexico who are engaged in liberation efforts for formerly enslaved people. So many of these women, for example, Sylvia Weber, the Jackson family, and then as I mentioned earlier, Vicente Guerrero. So what I want you to do after this webinar and you go back to your curriculum, I just showed you an example of sort of how I approach something that I already taught, that was already part of my curriculum, and how I thought, how can I approach this from an anti-racist, anti-colonial perspective? So I want you to think about all of these topics. These are common topics from a level 1 and level 2 language class. Think about how you can take this topic and maybe come up with a deeper essential question that would create a point of entry, like I did with the unit that I just showed you. Or maybe a subtopic that centers minoritized, or let's just say minoritized or marginalized experiences and perspectives. Or maybe an accessible and comprehensible resource that presents a counter narrative. Maybe that's where you start. You found a good resource that gives a counter narrative and you're going to incorporate that. Speaking of resources, the next thing I want to talk about is how can we select and analyze text? This has become very popular recently, which I'm so excited about because this is old research from like 1990, reading Sims Bishop, but I hear it a lot more nowadays, which I think is great because it indicates that we're thinking about this more. But when she was talking about selecting literary resources for students, she mentions how they should be a window where students can, look out into the world of others, a mirror where they can see themselves in the resource, a sliding door where they can enter into the cultures and communities of others. And that can be figurative or literal, like through study abroad or study away programs. And then Uju Anya and I, when we were reflecting on this framework, we added that it should also be a lens so that we think about how what I see when I look in my mirror might be different than might impact what I see when I would then go and look out the window, and how when someone else is looking out the same window that I'm looking out of, we see different things based on what we saw when we look at the mirror, right? Our own individual background. So that critical piece is important as well. Where do we find these resources? I recommend Twitter, social media. I just talked about TikTok being a great resource. Looking at ways that these communities, people who are engaged in liberation, are sharing about that. And a lot of that does happen via social media. Specialized community groups like Actful SIGs or even Facebook. Student-created resources. I guarantee you there's students in your class who have been thinking about their own liberation and who have been producing pieces of work, be they songs or poems or art related to that. That's always been the case with me, and I love being able to incorporate that into the class. I wish I had time to talk about it and to share examples, because a lot of that has been very transformative for me and my students. And then think about your own research. How are you consuming the perspectives of marginalized groups? Select resources that present counterpoints and counter narratives that don't oversimplify diversity, even when you're dealing with novice level learners. And I have a quick example of how you can take something and quickly implement a critical perspective, even if it's a resource where learners at their level won't be able to understand the entire thing. You can focus on the title, you can focus on an image. Meredith White, superstar, we all know and love her. She tweeted this a while ago about how she engages her students in what she calls one-word answer. And so she has very simple questions here related to an article that's discussing something very profound, very deep, very serious. But she has students focus on what's one word to answer this, right? And that's something that even the novice level students can do by skimming the title or looking at the images or that kind of thing. That's also interpretive communication. You don't actually have to be reading words and paragraphs to be engaged in interpretive communication. A framework that I like is Goldie Muhammad's culturally and historically responsive reading, responsive literacy framework. And it has 5 elements. She talks about identity, how will students make sense of who they and others are, skills, how will they develop proficiency? I modified the follow-up questions to fit language education. Intellect, what new and interesting knowledge will students have? Criticality, how will we make sure that our students are recognizing and understanding themes of power, equity, and anti-oppression? And then finally, and probably most important, joy. How do we help students celebrate the joy and beauty of themselves and others, including these often marginalized communities and cultures that we're studying? So I have a couple of examples here. The first couple of examples talk about linking resources to language proficiency goals, which I talked a little bit about earlier. So I want to share, when students are learning how to narrate in the past, right? In Spanish, the preterite and imperfect, but I'm really thinking about the communicative goal, talking about our experiences in the past. When students are engaged in that, a resource that I use for that is Me Gritaron Negra by Victoria Santa Cruz, who's Afro-Peruvian. And again, you'll be able to click in the presentation and hear this. But for those of you who don't speak Spanish, one of the stanzas here, this is at the very beginning of the song. She talks about how she was only 7. She heard someone yell black. And that was her first time sort of hearing it in a negative way. And she talked about how it kind of made her second guess her own identity and hate herself. And she backed down. And like I said, we want to focus on narratives of liberation, resistance, and joy, right? Well, the end of the song, she talks about her whole journey and how she eventually came to the point where she no longer backed down and she embraced her Blackness. And so it doesn't linger here in the oppression, although that is part of the story. And so what would you think would be a good follow-up activity for an intermediate low learner? Let's say you were using this in your class. What would you put there? And I see in the chat, someone is asking about, can the presentation be shared? I haven't actually shared it yet. I'll share it at the end. I'll give you the link to be able to access it. And so in my class with this, I had them compose a personal narrative where they wrote a paragraph highlighting a time in their lives in which they learned something from a negative and unpleasant or difficult experience. And I give them the support that they need to be able to do that. Okay, if you're talking about descriptions, how old you were, where you were, this is the vocabulary and the structures that you need. What happened? And then what was the outcome? And so I give them the language support that they need in order to be able to communicate about that. And then we create a huge Padlet where you have pictures of the students, and a Padlet is like a huge digital bulletin board. You have pictures of the students as well as descriptions of their experiences that they talk about. Something that recently happened at the Golden Globes, maybe think of this other reading that I used to include in the class, but Shirley Ralph was asked by an interviewer. She's on the show Abbott Elementary. She has been in a lot of things. She was in the original Dreamgirls, etc. Wonderful actress. She says to the question, what would you tell your 15-year-old self? There's nothing wrong with your nose. There's nothing wrong with the shade of your skin. You know, in the future, there'll be people who will pay $10,000 to have your lips. So hang in there, Shirley Ralph, you're good. And so we use that as a starting point. And then for more advanced students, they can do something similar. What would you tell your former self using more advanced structures? Because if you teach Spanish, you know that you probably have to use some subjunctive in order to be able to complete that communicative task. And so we use the graphic poem by Ricardo Reyes called Yo le diría, I would tell him, where he talks about what he would tell his younger self if he could have a conversation with him. So you can see here, if you speak Spanish, I would tell him to take advantage of every moment, etc. The other example that I want to show you is Blaxican as a challenge to colonial racial constructs. So I co-designed this with one of my student teachers who did this in a 10th grade Spanish 2 class. Most of the students were 10th graders in that class. So the pre-reading activity, students talked about what are the most important aspects of their identity and how does your racial identity affect your daily life in each of the following contexts. So she had like in school, at work, with my family, etc. And they just selected 1 to 10. And you don't have to have a huge level of language proficiency in order to complete that activity. You just have to know your numbers 1 through 10 and know some of the basic vocabulary that's associated with identity. Then they watched a video called Black and Latinx, where people talked about the intersections of their identities of being Black and Latino or Latine or Latina. And you can see here from the vocabulary list that we came up with, a lot of these are words that students will be learning in other contexts anyway, like borrar, to erase. So instead of talking about erasing a blackboard or a whiteboard, we're talking about issues of erasing identity. So you're still incorporating that high frequency vocabulary that would normally be included at that level anyway. They watch another video challenging racial binaries that includes people who not only identify as Black and Latinx, but as other identities as well. And as a comprehension check, students write at least 2 comments summarizing 2 of the perspectives presented in the videos. And again, we give them the language support in order to be able to do that. This resource is linked, by the way, both in English and in Spanish. You can see here, this is one of the people who participated in the study, Larissa, I think her name is. She talks about her dad being Black and her mom being Mexican, and how she embraced the term Blaxican, which is a term that originated in that community, in order to be able to talk about her sort of dual identity. And the reflection questions that go along with that mirror what we just saw with Gholdy Muhammad's framework for engaging students critically with literature. So how might this text help students better understand their own and others' identities? How can we use this text to engage students in communication, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational? How can students come to a deeper understanding of race? And how can students engage critically in both L1 and L2? And how is this text an example of resistance, liberation, or joy? And I'll skip through the different things that people say, but I have this here to show that in this particular community, all these people are from relatively the same place. They're from Southern California. They all identify as Blaxican, but their experiences are so different. How they think about being Blaxican, how they came to embrace that term, very different. And so it helps combat stereotypes. There's no way that students will walk away from this activity thinking about, oh, this is what all people who identify as Blaxican feel, because it's just so messy and nuanced. There's no way that you can do that when you actually look at their experiences. So we do it in a personal activity where they conduct a role play in which they introduce themselves to the people that we just saw featured. And they think about what information would they share about their own identity? How would they describe themselves? What types of questions would be appropriate to ask about the experiences of others, right? And so we get into a little bit of sociocultural understanding there as well. And then critical reflection, if it's a novice class, I have students do this outside of class on a discussion board in English. If it's a higher level, we might do a combination of a discussion board in the target language and maybe a follow-up discussion in class in the target language. The students are capable of doing that. But we look at where is it necessary for them to maintain a double identity? What are the similarities and differences that they notice, not only with the people that we just read about, but also within the classroom community, with their classmates? How does Blaxican challenge traditional and often binary colonial, right, constructs of race and identity? And what are some specific ways that they can be an ally in their daily lives for issues that may not explicitly relate to their own identity? So in this case, if I'm a non-Black, non-Latinx person, how might I still align myself with issues that lead to justice for people who are of that identity? And we talk about that in Spanish class, and I think that's really cool. I want to end by talking about communities, and I think I'll skip over a little bit because I want a little bit of this because I want to make sure that we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. But my process for this is I start with the learning objectives, all right? What are the communicative contexts? What are my language functions? What are my sociocultural understandings? Then I move to what is a familiar narrative that I can include from the students' own communities. And that can also be a counter narrative. It doesn't have to be a dominant narrative, but just a narrative that's adjacent to them, to their communities that they can understand. And then I introduce a counter narrative from a speech community of the language being studied. And that may be the students' same community. I'm not saying that those two are mutually exclusive. The counter narrative can also be that speech community can be the community that our students live in, and often that's the case. And then that causes me to then revisit my learning objectives with that new mindset, having gone through the familiar narratives and the counter narratives from the so-called target community. An example of that is Choki Town, and I use a couple of their songs. The first one, Somos Pacifico, where I have students write a chorus in the same format as the chorus that you see there. So they use somos to talk about a general characteristic of their community. Estamos, what's an emotion or state or condition. Nos une, what's something that unites the people. With De Donde Vengo Yo, we do this comprehension activity, and then I have students think about in their community, what is the lifestyle like? What are some elements of pride? And what are some social problems? And again, this is done in the same format of the chorus of this particular song that students have already engaged with. And how can I engage then students at home and around the world? What I do is I use the answer to that third question to dictate how I move forward with this. When students talk about what are elements of pride in their community, what are some social problems, I use that to think about, okay, how are we approaching those problems in our own communities? And how are people outside of our communities, or even within our communities, who speak the language that we're studying, addressing those same issues? The example I have here is when I taught in Wilmington, North Carolina, which you may know about the 1898 massacre, where the predominantly the multiracial and Black elected officials and their families overthrown by the white mob in our community in 1898. We look at ways that our community has responded to that through public art, the Black Lives Matter monument that's on our campus, the banner that's on our language building, the renaming of public spaces that had been named of conspirators of the 1898 massacre. For example, renaming Hugh McCrae Park. I give them the vocabulary to engage in these conversations, and there's a link here if you want to talk about Black Lives Matter with your students. And then we look at how people from around the world are engaging with this same issue. How are people involved in racial justice in the communities that we're speaking? I have here examples in Spanish, Portuguese, and Korean. Another example is environmental justice. Just really quickly, this is a slide talking about how the current environmental justice movement began in the town of Warren, North Carolina, when Black and Latinx folks and Pacific Islanders and Native American people were protesting against the dumping of toxic waste in their neighborhoods. And I use that as a parallel to talk about how this happens around the world in other communities. As I was developing this presentation, I had like a few examples, and then I decided to add a little bit more. And I knew that it would make the webinar a little bit longer. So I did, but I did think it was important for you to see examples of what this actually looked like in the classroom instead of thinking about it at the theoretical level. The last piece of the presentation is just about overcoming challenges. And I think that's something that you'll be able to go through on your own. I talk about some challenges, some small everyday steps that we can take. I have an example of what my syllabus statement looks like for a class so that I can prepare students for what they're going to experience that might be different from a traditional language class that they've had in the past. And I go over what the goals of that statement are so that you have a framework if you want to develop a similar statement for your particular class. I talk about some ways for engagement with our students, how we can make sure that we are creating a classroom community that allows students to approach some of these topics that traditionally are controversial. And then I have here a link to additional resources that you can access where if you just click on these, there's a link to the Anti-Racist World Language Classroom, which I think is very great text. There's a link to Florida National University's curriculum for a Spanish 1 and 2 curriculum based on centering Blackness in the language classroom. And all of that is open access, free resources. And then if you're more interested in the theory of language education and how we go about thinking about it from anti-colonial perspectives, I have a link there to a volume that includes academic articles on that particular topic. The moral of the story: think big, start small, and go for an early win. And so I will stop talking there, and I'm willing to stay for, I wanted to finish by 5:50, but I'll stay on for a few minutes, 5:55 now. I'll stay on for maybe just a couple of minutes after 6 o'clock to be able to at least get a few questions.
LJ, thank you so much. This was wonderful. All of the snaps, fire emojis, claps, whatever you got, this was really, really great. Thank you so much for taking the time today to give this wonderful presentation. And as he said, we are open to any questions that you might have. Please feel free to share at the moment.
And I'll go ahead and go to the next slide just because I know maybe people have to leave right at 6 o'clock, maybe I start signing off. But that's where you can get the link to the slide deck. And if you have questions about anything, just let me know. Would anyone like to share about maybe what their next step is? I see here, can you address he, they in Spanish class, like inclusive language, I guess is what that is talking about from Diane. And if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, please correct me. I'm not, oh, hey, Paul. I'm not exactly sure. For me, maybe it's just my context and experiences that I've had, but I haven't really had many issues with the whole inclusive language and non-binary language in Spanish. If I can go back to, let's see. Yeah, here's an example. Like when I, for example, present vocabulary, and it's something that can be, like if it's an adjective or a noun that ends in O that can be changed to something else depending on the gender identity of the person, I just put an X and I just put an asterisk and say the X can be written as A, E, O, or X depending on the gender identity of the person who is speaking or the person who's being described. And I usually don't run into a lot of issues with that. And people who are binary, who do use non-binary identity markers, they incorporate those as are needed. Oh, hi, Amanda. Konbawa. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions before we wrap up? For those of you who attended this, this is recorded, as you know, it will be uploaded to YouTube fairly shortly. So if you had friends, colleagues you know that weren't able to attend, they'll be able to watch it very soon.
Thanks, Lauren, for that question. And if other people have input, please put it in. I don't claim to know all the answers to this. This is something that we're all pushing through and working towards in our path to justice. But the question was the importance of incorporating anti-racist and anti-colonial pedagogies in large language programs at the university. How do we go about doing that? And I think using the data from the studies that I presented, like the study from Anya, and then she and I also have a paper together, and then Tasha Austin, that links how this impacts, and then also Cassandra Glenn has some articles about this as well, how this impacts the diversity of the people who end up staying in language study, right? So that's important. This is the future of our field. And we want to have people in our classes who represent the diversity of the students that they're teaching. There is a district here, and I visited their school, and very nice school. They have a Spanish opening for a Spanish teacher, 0 applicants. And it would be, if I were looking for a job, this would be like a dream school for me to work in, but there's just no one here to fill that need. And so I think it's important because it dictates the future of our profession. And so I think that's something that might connect with people who have the autonomy to make those types, so the power to make those types of decisions at that level at the university. And then also is linked very easily to the 5 C's, and what we as a profession have already agreed are things that students should know. Like a lot of this relates easily to like the cultures, the communities, the comparison C's. So I think it complements very well what we already say language learning is about. Thanks, Lauren. And I'm excited to see you all at the Central States Conference. I haven't registered yet, but I do plan to. It'd be nice to attend a conference and not present, just be there as an attendee. I have not done that in a long time, so I'm excited about it. I agree, Diane. Yes, very important.
All right, well, LJ, I don't know if there are any other questions. As you mentioned, though, be sure to register for the Central States Conference. We'll be there, as well as many of the other people here from Central States. We're so glad to have them today, as well as Dr. Randolph. It was a pleasure. If there aren't any other questions, I'll close this out and hope you all have a great night.
Okay, wonderful. Hey, Rachel. I'm just sitting here like saying hello to all the people. Thank y'all for coming. This is
yes, thank you.
I wish I could have seen everyone's face, but great.
Awesome. Thank you. See you, LJ.